Here's something most people don't realize about the history of philosophy. Some of the most sophisticated, rigorous, and genuinely world-altering philosophical traditions never made it into the Western university curriculum. We spend semesters on Plato, Kant, Hegel, and those thinkers absolutely deserve that attention. But there's a whole other world of philosophical inquiry that was happening simultaneously, independently, and at an equally breathtaking level of depth. Today we're stepping into that world. We're going to spend the next 35 minutes or so with a thinker named Jaimini, an ancient Indian philosopher who asked a question so precise, so focused, and so consequential that it launched one of the longest-running philosophical debates in human history, a debate that is, in a very real sense, still going. The question? What does it mean to act rightly? And how could we ever truly know? 4 words of Sanskrit. One of the most sophisticated philosophical traditions humanity has ever produced. By the end of this lecture, you're going to understand not just who Jaimini was, but why the problems he was wrestling with are problems that any serious thinker, in any tradition, in any century, eventually has to face. Jaimini lived somewhere between the 4th and 2nd centuries BCE, and I want to pause on that uncertainty for a moment, because it's actually philosophically interesting rather than just annoying. We don't know exactly when he lived. Scholars continue to debate his precise dates, and yet his ideas were so carefully preserved, so rigorously transmitted, so relentlessly commented upon and argued over, that they shaped Hindu philosophical thought for over 2,000 years. The man himself recedes into historical uncertainty, while his arguments remain razor-sharp. There's something almost fitting about that. A philosopher who believed that truly authoritative knowledge transcends its human origins, himself becoming a kind of authorless voice echoing through centuries. But here's what we do know. Jaimini was operating in a specific intellectual crisis, and understanding that crisis is the key to understanding everything he wrote. The Vedas, the ancient sacred scriptures of the Indian tradition, were under pressure. Not military pressure, not political pressure, but interpretive pressure. Centuries had passed since these texts were composed. Rituals had become complicated. Passages seemed to conflict with each other. People were asking hard questions. What do these texts actually mean? How do we apply ancient injunctions to new situations? And, the really dangerous question, do they still matter at all? Jaimini's answer was not defensive or anxious. It was philosophical, systematic, rigorous. He didn't just say the Vedas matter because they're sacred. He built an entire philosophical architecture to explain why they matter, how we know what they mean, and what they're actually telling us to do. That philosophical architecture is called Pūrva-Mīmāṃsā, and it begins with a text called the Mimamsa-Sutra. The word itself is worth sitting with for a moment. Mimamsa. It means investigation, critical inquiry, not acceptance, not devotion, not blind faith. Inquiry. The very name of this school tells you something important about its character. This is a tradition that takes seriously the idea that sacred texts require rigorous intellectual engagement, not just reverent recitation. Now, Mimamsa sits within the 6 classical Astika schools of Hindu philosophy. Astika, and this is a crucial term, means orthodox in the specific sense of accepting the authority of the Vedas. These are schools that say, yes, the Vedas are a valid source of knowledge. That's the common thread. But what they do with that commitment varies enormously. And within Mimamsa itself, there's a fascinating split that you'll see on this slide. 2 distinct branches that end up going in almost opposite philosophical directions. Pūrva-Mīmāṃsā, Jaimini's school, means prior inquiry or earlier investigation. It's focused on the ritual portions of the Vedas, the hymns, the injunctions, the ceremonial prescriptions. Its central question is essentially practical. How do we act rightly according to what the Vedas tell us? This is philosophy in the service of action. Uttara-Mīmāṃsā, which you probably know better as Vedanta, means later inquiry. It's focused on the philosophical and metaphysical portions of the Vedas, particularly the Upanishads. Its central question is contemplative. What is the ultimate nature of reality? What is Brahman? What is the self? Here's where it gets genuinely interesting. These 2 schools are reading the same texts, the same Vedas, and they're arriving at almost completely different philosophical projects. One is asking how to perform a fire ritual correctly. The other is asking whether the individual self is identical to ultimate reality. That tension, between right action and ultimate knowledge, between ethics and metaphysics, between doing and being, is one of the deepest fault lines in all of philosophy. Not just Indian philosophy, all philosophy. Jaimini plants his flag firmly on the side of action, and that choice has consequences that ripple through everything he argues. So, what did Jaimini actually write? The Mimamsa-Sutra is, by any measure, a remarkable document. Approximately 2,700 sutras spread across 12 chapters, making it one of the longest philosophical works in the entire Indian tradition. And yet, if you picked it up and tried to read it cold, you would be almost completely lost within the first few pages. That's not a criticism. That's the nature of the sutra form itself. Sutra literally means thread, and that's exactly what these texts are. Bare, compressed threads of argument, stripped of every explanatory word that isn't absolutely necessary. The ancient Indian philosophical tradition had a very practical reason for this. These texts were meant to be memorized, transmitted orally, carried in the mind across generations. Every unnecessary syllable was a burden on memory, so every unnecessary syllable was cut. The result is a text that is philosophically dense to the point of being almost cryptic. A single sutra might be 4 or 5 words in Sanskrit, and those 4 or 5 words might contain an argument that requires 3 pages of commentary to properly unpack. Which brings us to the commentators. And this is something worth understanding about how Indian philosophy actually works. A philosophical text in this tradition is never just the original sutras. It's the sutras plus the accumulated layers of commentary that make them intelligible. Think of it less like a single book and more like a living conversation across centuries. For the Mimamsa-Sutra, the gateway into that conversation is Shabara, whose commentary, written somewhere around the 1st to 3rd century CE, became the essential lens through which Jaimini's sutras were read. Without Shabara, the sutras remain threads. With him, they become a tapestry. Then comes Kumarilabhata in the 7th century, one of the most formidable philosophical minds in Indian history, who wrote a sub-commentary defending Mimamsa against a serious philosophical challenge. We'll come back to him later. But for now, just hold on to this image. Jaimini writes the threads. Shabara weaves them into cloth. Kumarila armors that cloth against attack. That's how a philosophical tradition survives 2,000 years. Athato dharma jijñāsa. Now therefore the inquiry into dharma. That's it. That's the entire first sutra. 4 words in Sanskrit. And they set the agenda for everything that follows. There's a reason scholars keep coming back to this opening. It's one of those philosophical moments where extraordinary compression produces extraordinary power. 4 words that contain a whole worldview. But what is dharma? Because this is a term that gets thrown around a lot, often loosely, and Jaimini is using it with surgical precision. Dharma here doesn't mean karma in the popular sense. It doesn't mean cosmic justice or spiritual destiny. In Jaimini's usage, dharma means something closer to rightful obligation, the specific duties, ritual responsibilities, and correct actions that a person is bound to perform. It's ethics, but ethics understood through the lens of sacred prescription rather than rational calculation. It's not, what would a reasonable person do? It's what has been commanded. And here's where Jaimini makes his first genuinely radical philosophical move. He argues that dharma, this knowledge of what we are obligated to do, cannot be arrived at through ordinary perception. You cannot see your ritual obligations. You cannot touch them or taste them. They don't show up in sensory experience. Can we get there through inference then? Through reasoning from what we observe? Jaimini says no. Inference works beautifully for the empirical world. We see smoke, we infer fire, we're right. But dharma isn't an empirical fact. You cannot reason your way to the conclusion that a specific ritual must be performed on a specific occasion using specific materials in a specific sequence. That kind of knowledge doesn't emerge from observation and logic. So where does it come from? The Vedas. Only the Vedas. This is not a casual claim. This is a precise epistemological argument. Jaimini is saying that there exists a category of knowledge of what we ought to do, that is simply inaccessible to the ordinary instruments of human cognition. Perception fails. Inference fails. Only sacred testimony succeeds. Think about what that means for a moment. He's not just saying the Vedas are useful or inspiring or culturally important. He's saying they are epistemologically irreplaceable, that without them, an entire domain of knowledge is permanently closed to us. That's a breathtaking philosophical commitment, and it immediately raises the obvious question. Okay, but why should we trust the Vedas? What makes them authoritative? Which is exactly where slide 6 takes us. This is where Jaimini does something that I find genuinely astonishing, and I've been thinking about this tradition for a long time. He doesn't defend the Vedas by appealing to God. He doesn't say a divine being composed them, and therefore they're trustworthy. He doesn't appeal to the authority of ancient sages or the weight of tradition. Those would be relatively conventional moves. Instead, he makes a claim that is philosophically far more radical and far more interesting. The Vedas, Jaimini argues, are eternal and authorless. Apauruṣeya, not made by any person, not composed by God, not written by humans, not revealed to sages who then wrote them down. They simply exist, timelessly, necessarily, without origin. Wait, back up for a second. How does that even work? Here's the argument. If the Vedas were composed by a human being, even a supremely wise human being, they would carry the limitations of that human being, the biases, the errors, the historical situatedness of any finite mind. Human knowledge is fallible. Human memory is imperfect. Human understanding is partial. A text authored by humans inherits all of that fragility. If the Vedas were composed by God, a different problem emerges, one that Mimamsa philosophers actually pressed quite hard. How do we verify that the text accurately represents divine intention? We'd need some independent means of confirming that what we have is genuinely what God meant, and that independent means would itself require justification. You end up in a regress. But if the Vedas are eternal, if they have no author, no origin, no moment of composition, then they carry none of these vulnerabilities. They aren't a human record of something. They aren't a divine communication filtered through human transmission. They simply are. And what simply is, timelessly and necessarily, cannot be wrong. Now, and this is the move that launches centuries of debate, this argument depends entirely on a specific theory of language. Because if the Vedas are eternal, then the words of the Vedas must also be eternal. Language itself, on this view, isn't a human invention. The relationship between a word and its meaning isn't arbitrary or conventional. It's necessary and timeless. Shabda, verbal testimony, linguistic knowledge, becomes in Jaimini's system not just one source of knowledge among many, but the primary source for an entire domain of reality, the domain of what we ought to do. Here's what's remarkable about this. Jaimini is essentially arguing that language has a kind of metaphysical depth that goes beyond human convention. That words aren't just sounds we've agreed to attach meanings to. They participate in something permanent. This sparked one of the most sophisticated debates in the history of philosophy of language. Buddhist philosophers pushed back hard. Other Hindu schools pushed back. The debate over whether linguistic meaning is natural or conventional, eternal or constructed, is one that Western philosophy of language is still having, just in different terminology. Jaimini got there first, and he got there because he was trying to solve a very practical problem. How do we know what we're supposed to do? So we know that the Vedas are the irreplaceable source of Dharma. We know their authority rests on their eternal, authorless nature. But here's the question that naturally follows. What exactly are the Vedas doing when they speak? This might sound like a strange question. Surely a text is just saying things, making claims about reality? Jaimini's answer is more precise than that, and more interesting. He argues that the primary function of Vedic language is not to describe, but to command. The Vedas aren't primarily giving us information about the world, they're telling us what to do. Their fundamental mode is injunction, vidi, the ritual command. Now, this is a philosophically sophisticated observation about language that Western philosophy wouldn't systematically develop until J.L. Austin's speech act theory in the 20th century. Austin famously argued that language doesn't just describe states of affairs, it performs actions. When a judge says, "I sentence you," something happens in the world. When a priest says, "I now pronounce you married," a new reality comes into existence. Language does things. Jaimini understood this over 2 millennia earlier, not as a general theory of language, but as a precise analysis of how sacred text operates. And he developed a remarkably sophisticated taxonomy of how Vedic injunctions work. At the foundation sits the primary injunction, the core ritual duty. This is the central act that must be performed. Think of it as the main clause of a sacred command, the irreducible kernel of obligation around which everything else is organized. Then come the subsidiary injunctions, the supporting details that qualify, refine, and specify the primary act. How must it be performed? With what materials? At what time? In what sequence? These aren't optional elaborations. They're integral to the correct performance of the ritual. Getting the primary injunction right but the subsidiary details wrong isn't a partial success. In Jaimini's framework, it's a failure. And then there are prohibitions, explicit restrictions on what must never be done within a ritual context. These aren't simply the absence of commands. They're positive constraints that shape the ritual space just as actively as the injunctions themselves. What Jaimini has built here is essentially a grammar of sacred action, a formal structure that allows you to parse any Vedic passage and identify precisely what kind of speech act it is performing, what it is commanding, and how it relates to the other commands surrounding it. And here's why this matters beyond the ritual context. Any tradition that inherits a body of authoritative text, legal, religious, constitutional, faces exactly this problem. When you read a law, a scripture, a founding document, you need to know, is this passage prescribing something, prohibiting something, qualifying something else, providing context? The failure to make these distinctions produces catastrophically bad interpretation. Jaimini was building the tools to make those distinctions with precision. Philosophy of language, philosophy of action, legal theory, all of it folded into a theory of how to read a ritual injunction correctly. Okay, time for a reality check. Even if you accept everything Jaimini has argued so far, eternal Vedas, authorless language, a sophisticated grammar of injunctions, you still face a problem that won't go away. And it's a problem that anyone who has ever seriously read a large, ancient, complex text will immediately recognize. Sometimes the text seems to contradict itself. Two passages, same scriptural authority, apparently incompatible instructions. What do? The naive response is to pick one and discard the other. But Jaimini can't do that. If the Vedas are eternal and authorless and epistemologically irreplaceable, you cannot simply throw out the passages that inconvenience you. Every word carries the same absolute authority. Discarding a Vedic passage isn't just intellectually unsatisfying, it's philosophically incoherent given everything the system is built on. So Jaimini does something far more interesting. He develops a set of hermeneutical principles, systematic rules of interpretation, that allow apparent contradictions to be resolved without abandoning either passage. And the master key to all of these principles is a single insight. Context determines meaning. This sounds almost obvious when stated plainly. Of course, context matters. But Jaimini works out the implications of this insight with extraordinary rigor. The meaning of any Vedic passage is not self-contained. It cannot be read in isolation. Every word, every phrase, every injunction exists within a ritual context. And that context shapes what the passage means and how it should be applied. So when two passages appear to conflict, the first move is not to declare one of them wrong. The first move is to ask, are these passages operating in the same ritual context? Are they addressing the same situation? Are they speaking to the same kind of agent performing the same kind of act? Very often the answer is no. What looked like a contradiction dissolves when you realize the two passages are simply addressing different ritual circumstances. They're not competing answers to the same question. They're answers to different questions that happen to look similar on the surface. When genuine tension remains even after contextual analysis, Jaimini has further principles. More specific injunctions take precedence over more general ones. Later passages can qualify earlier ones. The overall purpose of a ritual sequence provides a framework for adjudicating between competing details. Now, here's where it gets weird, in the best possible way. These interpretive principles didn't stay inside Mimamsa philosophy, they migrated. Classical Indian legal scholars drew directly on Jaimini's hermeneutical framework when developing methods for interpreting legal texts. Theologians across multiple traditions used his principles when navigating apparent contradictions in their own scriptures. The tools Jaimini built for reading ritual injunctions became the foundational toolkit for textual interpretation across an entire civilization. Western philosophy has a parallel story. Medieval Christian scholars developed elaborate hermeneutical principles for resolving apparent biblical contradictions, and modern legal theory is saturated with interpretive doctrines that would have been recognizable to Jaimini. But the Indian tradition got there with remarkable systematic rigor, and Jaimini is the person who built the foundation. There's a reason he's called the father of Indian hermeneutics. He didn't just solve a problem about Vedic ritual, he invented a discipline. Here's something that often surprises people when they first encounter Indian philosophy seriously. They expect to find spirituality, cosmology, maybe some ethics. What they don't expect to find is epistemology, a rigorous, systematic, technically sophisticated theory of how human beings acquire knowledge. But that's exactly what Mimamsa delivers. And in some respects it delivers it more comprehensively than any Western school before the modern period. The Sanskrit term is pramāṇa, valid source of knowledge. A pramāṇa isn't just any way of arriving at a belief. It's a legitimate means of knowing, a cognitive process that reliably produces true knowledge rather than mere opinion or lucky guessing. The question of which pramāṇas are valid and why is one of the central battlegrounds of classical Indian philosophy. Different schools accepted different lists. The debates between them were fierce, technically demanding, and philosophically rich. Jaimini's school recognized 6. Pratyaksa, perception, direct sensory experience. This one is relatively uncontroversial. When you see a mango, you know there's a mango. Perception gives you immediate, direct contact with the world. Anumana, inference, reasoning from evidence. You see smoke on the mountain, you infer fire. You observe the river is swollen, you infer it rained upstream. Inference extends your knowledge beyond what you can directly perceive. Shabda, verbal testimony, knowledge transmitted through language. Someone tells you something, and if they're a reliable source, you come to know it. This is where the Vedas fit, as the ultimate, perfectly reliable source of verbal testimony about dharma. Upamana, comparison or analogy. You've never seen a gavaya, a kind of wild cow, but someone tells you it resembles a domestic cow. When you encounter one in the forest, you recognize it through that analogy. This is a genuinely distinct form of knowing that doesn't reduce neatly to perception or inference. Now we get to Mimamsa's original contributions, the 2 pramāṇas that Jaimini's school added to Indian epistemology and defended against considerable skepticism. Arthāpatti, postulation. This is knowing something by recognizing that without it, something else you know would be inexplicable. The classic example. You know your friend Devadatta is alive. You also know he hasn't been home in weeks. These 2 facts create a tension that demands resolution. You postulate, you're rationally compelled to conclude, that he must be living somewhere else. You haven't perceived this directly. You haven't inferred it from a causal chain. You've arrived at it because it's the only way to make sense of facts you already hold. This is a genuinely distinct cognitive move. And Mimamsa philosophers were right to insist it can't be collapsed into ordinary inference. It's not reasoning from cause to effect or from sign to signified. It's reasoning from inexplicability to the only explanation that resolves it. Philosophers of science will recognize something very close to this in what we now call inference to the best explanation. Anupalabdhi, non-apprehension, knowledge through the absence of something. You walk into a room and you know there is no elephant in it. How do you know that? Not through perception. You didn't perceive the elephant's absence. You perceived nothing where an elephant would be if it were there. Not through inference. There's no causal chain from absent elephant to your knowledge. You know through non-apprehension, the failure of perception to find something that would be perceptible if it existed. Again, this sounds almost too simple. But the philosophical work required to establish non-apprehension as a genuine and irreducible source of knowledge, rather than just a special case of perception or inference, is considerable. And the Mimamsa philosophers did that work with impressive rigor. What you're looking at in this slide is not just a list. It's a map of the entire territory of human knowledge, an attempt to identify every legitimate pathway by which a mind can come to know something true about the world. 6 pathways, each one distinct, each one defended against the objection that it reduces to one of the others. And sitting at the center of this epistemological architecture, doing the specific work that perception and inference cannot do, is Shabda, verbal testimony, and above all, the eternal verbal testimony of the Vedas. The whole system hangs together. That's what makes it philosophically serious rather than just religiously motivated. So here's the thing nobody talks about when they introduce Indian philosophy in a Western academic context. They'll tell you about the metaphysics. They'll mention karma and rebirth and the nature of Brahman. They'll gesture toward meditation and the pursuit of liberation. All of that is real and important. But they often skip past the thinkers who built the intellectual infrastructure, the philosophers who developed the tools of reasoning, interpretation, and epistemology that made sophisticated Indian thought possible in the first place. Jaimini is one of those infrastructure builders, and the structures he built are still standing. Consider what he actually accomplished. He established hermeneutics, the systematic theory of textual interpretation, as a rigorous philosophical discipline in India. Before Jaimini, there were certainly practices of Vedic interpretation, but Jaimini turned those practices into a science. He asked, what are the principles that govern correct interpretation? How do we know when we've understood a text rightly? What do we do when passages conflict? These questions, and the systematic answers he developed, became the foundation for how educated Indians read authoritative texts for over 2 millennia. Legal scholars, theologians, grammarians, all of them working within a framework Jaimini built. Consider the debate over Vedic authority that he initiated. Every subsequent school of Hindu philosophy had to take a position on this debate. The schools that agreed with Jaimini built on his arguments. The schools that disagreed, and there were significant ones, had to develop sophisticated counter-arguments that engaged his position seriously. You cannot understand Vedanta without understanding what it's responding to. You cannot understand the Buddhist philosophical tradition's engagement with Hindu thought without understanding the Mimamsa positions those Buddhist thinkers were arguing against. Jaimini set the terms of the conversation. His theory of eternal language influenced Indian philosophy of language, Vyakarana, for centuries. The great grammarian Bhartrhari, whose work on the philosophy of language is genuinely world-class by any standard, is in deep dialogue with Mimamsa linguistic theory. The question of whether linguistic meaning is natural or conventional, whether words and their meanings are timelessly connected or arbitrarily linked by human agreement, is a question that Western philosophy of language is still actively debating. Jaimini staked out a position on that question with remarkable philosophical precision. And then there's the question that sits underneath all of this, the question that makes Jaimini not just historically significant, but genuinely contemporary. When we inherit authoritative texts, sacred scriptures, constitutional documents, legal codes, canonical works of any kind, how do we read them rightly? How do we interpret them faithfully without being imprisoned by interpretations that no longer fit our circumstances? How do we resolve apparent contradictions within them? How do we distinguish the core from the peripheral, the timeless from the time-bound? These are not ancient questions. They are live, urgent, consequential questions being argued right now in courtrooms, in religious communities, in legislative chambers, in university seminars. Originalism versus living constitutionalism in legal theory. Literalism versus contextual interpretation in biblical scholarship. Textualism versus purposivism in statutory interpretation. Jaimini was here first, and his answers, even where you might ultimately disagree with them, are serious enough to deserve serious engagement. That's the mark of a genuinely great philosopher. Not that everyone agrees with them, but that you cannot think clearly about the problems they addressed without eventually having to reckon with what they said. One of the things I want you to take away from this lecture, and this applies to philosophy broadly, not just to Jaimini, is that great philosophical work doesn't end conversations. It starts them. A lesser thinker produces a system so complete, so self-contained, so apparently airtight that there's nothing left to do but accept it or walk away. A truly great thinker produces a system so rich, so generative, so full of genuinely difficult problems that it becomes a kind of intellectual engine, powering debate, inspiring response, forcing even its opponents to sharpen their thinking in ways they never would have managed alone. Jaimini was that kind of thinker. Look at what happened after him. The first major development comes with Shabara, writing somewhere around the 1st to 3rd century CE. Shabara's commentary on the Mimamsa-Sutra isn't just an explanation, it's a philosophical intervention. He takes Jaimini's compressed threads and weaves them into something that can actually be taught, argued over, and built upon. Without Shabara, the Mimamsa-Sutra remains largely inaccessible. With him, it becomes the foundation of a living school. Every subsequent Mimamsa philosopher is, in a very real sense, a reader of Shabara reading Jaimini. Then comes the figure who I think deserves far more attention in global philosophy curricula than he currently receives. Kumarila Bhatta, writing in the 7th century CE, faced a challenge that Jaimini himself never had to confront directly. By Kumarila's time, Buddhist philosophy had developed into one of the most formidable intellectual traditions in human history. Buddhist epistemologists, particularly in the tradition of Dignaga and Dharmakirti, had produced sophisticated arguments that cut directly at the foundations of Mimamsa. They challenged the validity of Vedic testimony. They questioned the theory of eternal language. They pressed hard on the epistemological claims that Jaimini's entire system depended upon. Kumarila's response was not defensive or anxious. It was a full philosophical counteroffensive, rigorous, technically demanding, and genuinely brilliant. He didn't just defend Mimamsa. He strengthened it. He identified weaknesses in the original arguments and rebuilt them on more secure foundations. He engaged Buddhist epistemology on its own terms and argued point by point that Mimamsa could withstand the challenge. The result is one of the great philosophical confrontations in the history of human thought. Two extraordinarily sophisticated traditions, Mimamsa and Buddhist epistemology, pushing each other to greater and greater levels of precision and rigor. Neither would have reached those heights without the pressure of the other. Alongside Kumarila, and in significant tension with him, stands Prabhakara, also writing in the 7th to 8th century. Prabhakara accepted the basic Mimamsa framework but disagreed with Kumarila on several important points. particularly around the nature of cognition and the theory of error. The result was two rival schools within Mimamsa itself, the Pata school following Kumarila and the Prabhakara school following Prabhakara. This internal debate is a sign of philosophical vitality, not fragmentation. A tradition that can sustain serious internal disagreement while maintaining its core commitments is a tradition with real intellectual depth. And then there's Jayanta Bhatta in the 9th century, a philosopher who engaged Mimamsa from a Nyaya perspective, pressing particularly hard on questions about the existence of God and the nature of testimony. Jayanta's debates with Mimamsa thinkers on whether God's existence can be established through inference and whether Vedic authority requires a divine author to be legitimate represent some of the most technically sophisticated philosophical exchanges in the classical Indian tradition. What you're looking at across these 5 figures, Jaimini, Shabara, Kumarila, Prabhakara, Jayanta, is not a story of one man's ideas being passively transmitted across centuries. It's a story of living philosophical argument. Ideas being tested, challenged, refined, defended, extended, and sometimes transformed beyond what their originator might have recognized. That's what philosophy looks like when it's working properly. And it all begins with one man asking one question with extraordinary precision. What does it mean to act rightly? And how could we ever truly know? Athato Dharma Jijñāsa. Now therefore, the inquiry into Dharma. I want to end where Jaimini began. Not because it's tidy or symmetrical, though it is, but because I genuinely think these 4 words deserve to be the last thing sitting in your mind as you leave this lecture. Think about the weight of that opening word. Atha. Now. It implies that something has already happened. There's a before. Something has been learned, experienced, lived through. And now, in light of all of that, the inquiry begins. This isn't idle philosophical curiosity. This is the question that arises when you've taken life seriously enough to realize that acting rightly isn't obvious, that knowing what you ought to do isn't simple, that the gap between what you want and what you should do is real and sometimes agonizing. Atha. Now. After all of that, the inquiry begins. And then Dharma Jijñāsa. The inquiry into Dharma. Not the answer to Dharma. Not the possession of Dharma. The inquiry. Jaimini names his project as a search, not an arrival. Even for a philosopher who believed the Vedas provided certain knowledge of our obligations, the act of understanding what that knowledge means, how to apply it, how to interpret it correctly, that remains an ongoing, demanding, never quite finished intellectual project. Here's what I want you to carry out of this room today. Every one of us inherits authoritative texts of some kind. Maybe they're religious scriptures. Maybe they're constitutional documents. Maybe they're the accumulated wisdom of a family tradition, a professional code of ethics, a cultural inheritance you didn't choose but can't simply discard. Every one of us faces the question of how to read those texts rightly, how to be faithful to what they genuinely mean rather than what we wish they meant, or what a superficial reading suggests they mean. Every one of us faces moments where 2 things we hold as authoritative seem to pull in different directions, where the principle we've committed to and the situation we're actually in don't map cleanly onto each other, where interpretation is unavoidable and the stakes are real. Jaimini built a philosophical system to address exactly these challenges. You may not accept his specific answers. You may not share his commitment to Vedic authority, but the problems he identified, the epistemological gap between what we can observe and what we ought to do, the necessity and difficulty of interpretation, the question of what makes any text genuinely authoritative, those problems are yours too. They belong to anyone who takes seriously the question of how to live. 2,000 years after a philosopher in ancient India wrote 4 words that launched one of the great intellectual traditions in human history, those 4 words still have the power to stop you in your tracks. Athato Dharma Jijñāsa. Now therefore, your inquiry begins.